nor nurse wounded feelings. Time and again did he oppose letting Jesus expose himself to danger, but when the Master would decide to take such risks, always was it Thomas who rallied the apostles with his courageous words, "Come on, comrades, let's go and die with him." Thomas was in some respects like Philip. He also wanted to be shown, but his outward expressions of doubt were based on entirely different intellectual operations. Thomas was analytical, not merely skeptical. As far as personal physical courage was concerned, he was one of the bravest among the 12. Thomas had some very bad days. He was blue and downcast at times. The loss of his twin sister when he was 9 years old had occasioned him much youthful sorrow and had added to his temperamental problems of later life. When Thomas would become despondent, sometimes it was Nathanael who helped him to recover, sometimes Peter, and not infrequently one of the Alphaeus twins. When he was most depressed, unfortunately he always tried to avoid coming in direct contact with Jesus. But the Master knew all about this, and had an understanding sympathy for this apostle when he was thus afflicted with depression and harassed by doubts. Sometimes Thomas would get permission from Andrew to go off by himself for a day or two, but he soon learned that such a course was not wise. He early found that it was best when he was downhearted to stick close to his work and to remain near his associates. But no matter what happened in his emotional life, he kept right on being an apostle. When the time actually came to move forward, it was always Thomas who said, "Let's go." Thomas is the great example of a human being who has doubts, faces them, and wins. He had a great mind. He was no carping critic. He was a logical thinker. He was the acid test of Jesus and his fellow apostles. If Jesus and his work had not been genuine, it could not have held a man like Thomas from the start to the finish. He had a keen and sure sense of fact. At the first appearance of fraud or deception, Thomas would have forsaken them all. Scientists may not fully understand all about Jesus and his work on earth, but there lived and worked with the Master and his human associates a man whose mind was that of a true scientist, Thomas Didymus, and he believed in Jesus of Nazareth. Thomas had a trying time during the days of the trial and crucifixion. He was for a season in the depths of despair, but he rallied his courage, stuck to the apostles, and was present with them to welcome Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. For a while he succumbed to his doubting depression, but eventually rallied his faith and courage. He gave wise counsel to the apostles after Pentecost, and, when persecution scattered the believers, went to Cyprus, Crete, the North African coast, and Sicily, preaching the glad tidings of the kingdom and baptizing believers. And Thomas continued preaching and baptizing until he was apprehended by the agents of the Roman government and was put to death in Malta. Just a few weeks before his death, he had begun the writing of the life and teachings of Jesus. 9 and 10. James and Judas Alphaeus. James and Judas, the sons of Alphaeus, the twin fishermen living near Charissa, were the 9th and 10th apostles and were chosen by James and John Zebedee. They were 26 years old and married, James having 3 children, Judas 2. There is not much to be said about these two commonplace fisherfolk. They loved their master, and Jesus loved them, but they never interrupted his discourses with questions. They understood very little about the philosophical discussions or the theological debates of their fellow apostles, but they rejoiced to find themselves numbered among such a group of mighty men. These two were almost identical in personal appearance, mental characteristics, and extent of spiritual perception. What may be said of one should be recorded of the other. Andrew assigned them to the work of policing the multitudes. They were the chief ushers of the preaching hours, and, in fact, the general servants and errand boys of the 12. They helped Philip with the supplies, they carried money to the families for Nathanael, and always were they ready to lend a helping hand to any one of the apostles. The multitudes of the common people were greatly encouraged to find two like themselves honored with places among the apostles. By their very acceptance as apostles, these mediocre twins were the means of bringing a host of faint-hearted believers into the kingdom. And, too, the common people took more kindly to the idea of being directed and managed by official ushers who were very much like themselves. James and Judas, who were also called Thaddeus and Lebbaeus, had neither strong points nor weak points. The nicknames given them by the disciples were good-natured designations of mediocrity. They were the least of all the apostles. They knew it, and felt cheerful about it. James Alphaeus especially loved Jesus because of the Master's simplicity. These twins could not comprehend the mind of Jesus, but they did grasp the sympathetic bond between themselves and the heart of their Master. Their minds were not of a high order. They might even reverently be called stupid, but they had a real experience in their spiritual natures. They believed in Jesus. They were sons of God and fellows of the kingdom. Judas Alphaeus was drawn toward Jesus because of the Master's unostentatious humility. Such humility linked with such personal dignity made a great appeal to Judas. The fact that Jesus would always enjoin silence regarding his unusual acts made a great impression on this simple child of nature. The twins were good-natured, simple-minded helpers, and everybody loved them. Jesus welcomed these young men of one talent to positions of honor on his personal staff in the kingdom, because there are untold millions of other such simple and fear-ridden souls on the worlds of space whom he likewise wishes to welcome into active and believing fellowship with himself and his outpoured spirit of truth. Jesus does not look down upon littleness, only upon evil and sin. James and Judas were little, but they were also faithful. They were simple and ignorant, but they were also big-hearted, kind, and generous. And how gratefully proud were these humble men on that day when the Master refused to accept a certain rich man as an evangelist, unless he would sell his goods and help the poor. When the people heard this, and beheld the twins among his counselors, they knew of a certainty that Jesus was no respecter of persons, but only a divine institution, the kingdom of heaven, could ever have been built upon such a mediocre human foundation. Only once or twice in all their association with Jesus did the twins venture to ask questions in public. Judas was once intrigued into asking Jesus a question when the Master had talked about revealing himself openly to the world. He felt a little disappointed that there were to be no more secrets among the 12, and he made bold to ask, "But, Master, when you do thus declare yourself to the world, how will you favor us with special manifestations of your goodness?" The twins served faithfully until the end, until the dark days of trial, crucifixion, and despair. They never lost their heart faith in Jesus, and, save John, they were the first to believe in his resurrection. But they could not comprehend the establishment of the kingdom. Soon after their Master was crucified, they returned to their families and nets. Their work was done. They had not the ability to go on in the more complex battles of the kingdom. But they lived and died conscious of having been honored and blessed with 4 years of close and personal association with the Son of God, the sovereign maker of a universe. 11. Simon the Zealot. Simon Zelotes, the 11th apostle, was chosen by Simon Peter. He was an able man of good ancestry and lived with his family at Capernaum. He was 28 years old when he became attached to the apostles. He was a fiery agitator and was also a man who spoke much without thinking. He had been a merchant in Capernaum before he turned his entire attention to the patriotic organization of the Zealots. Simon Zelotes was given charge of the diversions and relaxation of the apostolic group, and he was a very efficient organizer of the play life and recreational activities of the 12. Simon's strength was his inspirational loyalty. When the apostles found a man or woman who floundered in indecision about entering the kingdom, they would send for Simon. It usually required only about 15 minutes for this enthusiastic advocate of salvation through faith in God to settle all doubts and remove all indecision, to see a new soul born into the liberty of faith and the joy of salvation. Simon's great weakness was his material mindedness. He could not quickly change himself from a Jewish nationalist to a spiritually minded internationalist. 4 years was too short a time in which to make such an intellectual and emotional transformation, but Jesus was always patient with him. The one thing about Jesus which Simon so much admired was the Master's calmness, his assurance, poise, and inexplicable composure. Although Simon was a rabid revolutionist, a fearless firebrand of agitation, he gradually subdued his fiery nature until he became a powerful and effective preacher of peace on earth and goodwill among men. Simon was a great debater. He did like to argue, and when it came to dealing with the legalistic minds of the educated Jews or the intellectual quibblings of the Greeks, the